All right, good afternoon. Thanks everybody for showing up to Practical Risk-Based Decision Making. I'm Dr. Mann. I'm the director for the Center for Project Management Innovation. And I want to share with you a little bit about some important things that I've learned in my career history through aerospace that really, I think, connects to one of the challenges we have with just getting stuff done, with managing projects and getting things done in a way that actually produces the outcome we're desiring. And that's this idea of risk-based decision making. We're probably all familiar with the basic cost benefit analysis or the basic sort of decision analysis that you do in business. But risk-based decision making takes into account a whole separate set of criteria that try to get to the best possible outcome that is achievable. So throughout this presentation, we're going to use a tool called Mentimeter. This is an app that I use to kind of get input from the audience. So if you want to scan that QR code or use that URL, that's a great thing. And I'll put a link in the chat here that you can also just click on that and open a browser window and you get the same interface. The idea is just to get the interaction of the folks that are out there, whether you're attending in a conference room somewhere, you're at your desk at home, anywhere, just not if you're driving, okay? If you're driving, just let it be. But I like this as an interactive tool. Now, you'll see a few questions come up as we go, and those questions will be an opportunity to put your voice in, choose this, pick that, whatever. Now, I can put up, if you lose the URL, use the code, I can put that back up at any time. I can click that and add it on top of any slide anytime. So don't worry about getting it right now if you're not in a position to do that. We can pick that up anytime we need to. So just in the chat, or while we're waiting for some more people to log in, and what you see down here in the bottom right is this is just a number of people that have clicked this little thumbs up button. It kind of gives an idea of how many people are participating, and in the QR code itself, see, it looks like we have 12 people that are signed on the app. That's awesome. How many people, just kind of while we're waiting for a few more people to get into the app, how many folks have heard of risk-based decision making? You've heard of it, you've maybe attended some training on it, or it's a conversation that's come up with your leadership. Got a couple thumbs ups. Yeah, it kind of comes in and out of flavor. In certain sectors and certain organizations, it's very, 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 very popular. It's very, very much part of how you do business. But in places, especially organizations that tend to be under significantly more time constraints, it tends to drop off the radar because it doesn't feel like you're getting anywhere sometimes. But we're gonna look at the risk-based decision making. We're gonna answer a few questions today. We're gonna look at what it is. So what is it in a practical way? What is it in a practical way? We want to look at, what does this actually mean, both theoretically, but also when we consider how does this apply to our day-to-day work or our regular efforts, what does this actually mean? I want to kind of look at why we should use it. And it's certainly, like a lot of things, it has criteria. It's not usable in every single case, in every single place, but it is much more broadly usable than some folks would give credit to, especially folks that maybe have only ever tried it once. And then we're going to look at how to do it, how to actually do risk-based decision making. Now, I have just kind of a regular sort of notional example, but it applies to a lot of the kind of situations and sorts of situations that we're going to get into as we go. One thing I kind of want you to notice about risk-based decision making is yeah, there's the risk piece, but the risk-based decision making is a decision making tool. So if it does not necessarily get you to a solution, it lets you choose from among many potential solutions. It lets you it lets you move forward once you've kind of identified where you're trying to go, and helps you pick the correct path to get there, or the most efficacious path to get there. So keep that in mind throughout this. That we're not talking about how do you come up with something out of thin air. We're talking about how do you choose among many alternatives. So you have to be making a decision. And you'll see where this hooks in places where we ought to be making a decision, but we're not. We're just going with the first thing that comes to mind. And that's a good place to kind of start with risk-based decision making. Now, our first participation question for the day is, which is most critical to success for you or your organization? Is it ROI and profit, conventional business metrics? Is it the fastest result? Or is it a successful positive outcome? Which one is actually most critical in your organization? And this is just what is your perspective? What is your point of view? For some organizations, fast results, getting something out there to sell, getting something like a minimum viable product or something as fast as possible, that is the main success factor they go off of. For other organizations, it's how much cash can you rake in. That's it. But for others, it's the getting to a successful positive outcome. We've got almost everybody in. So it looks like we're mostly looking at the successful positive outcome, and that's really good, because in risk-based decision making, that is what we are going for. We are going for a successful positive outcome, not the best possible outcome, not the most revenue, not the not the highest ROI. We're going for the thing that is the positive outcome that we generally have the most likelihood of meeting most of our success criteria for. So, and this is different from a lot of organizations. Like I said, if you're looking at if your focus in an organization is mostly profit or just a strict ROI calculation, then that's going to drive behaviors that may compromise the actual success of projects. Because if you think about an organization that's looking for profit. Profit is just your revenue minus your expenses, and it's gonna drive behaviors that are going to increase revenues and reduce expenses, and that's where you get things like serial layoffs and stuff like that to achieve those ends, or cutting corners, and nothing inherently wrong with those, but when you cut corners, or when you maybe hire cheaper labor than what your project is demanding, then you're introducing additional risks into your project. Same thing with fastest result. If your goal is to get to the absolute fastest result, that's awesome. But sometimes just taking the fastest possible path is going to get you a speeding ticket. So we want the best. We want to get the successful positive outcome. That's what we're going for this whole thing. So what is risk-based decision making? It is just kind of what it sounds like. It's a systematic decision-making process that factors in risk as a majority criteria. The approach is used in a lot of fields. I mentioned I come from a couple decades in aerospace, and for aerospace, pretty much everything, at least all the operational stuff, is done by risk-based decision making. Everything, whether a plane takes off, if you want to fly a plane from Denver to Miami, you go through a risk-based decision-making process to decide if you're even going to take off. If there's bad weather in between you and Miami, you examine the various alternatives. You see, is the safe path to go straight to Miami? Is the safe path to maybe pick a different destination and wait? Is the safe path to just stay on the ground? And you weigh the relative risk and the relative the relative desirability of the outcome, and you come up with whatever your choice is. And that happens all along the way in aerospace. It happens when you take off. It happens when you make choices. It happens when you make routing decisions. It happens when there's somebody kind of being aggressive in the cabin, whatever it is. You're making a risk-based decision. So you're making a decision based on the risk in addition to other things. You see risk-based decision-making in manufacturing, where they decide in a lot of manufacturing processes, they decide where it is most important to put in, say, particular quality checks or particular safety measures in order to reduce the likelihood of having some kind of a problem and still meeting an acceptable cost threshold, still meeting an acceptable quality threshold, but not just going with a big broad brush and painting across the entire universe and saying, hey, we're going to apply this to everything. There are some standards out there for risk management. There's an ISO 31000 standard that you can look up, and also a National Institutes of Science. There's lots of places where you can find more information about risk-based decision making, and it's important, if you've never done it, to maybe examine how other organizations do it. We're going to focus today on just kind of a practical, just a sort of a practical usable example to get the basic concepts down. But in the grander scheme of things, there's going to be nuances and there's going to be different weighting criteria and stuff in your organization. But as long as you're focusing on the risk up front, as long as you're focusing on the acceptability of whatever risk profile you have, along with the necessary success criteria, such as achieving sufficient revenue, not necessarily maximum revenue, then you're doing something like risk-based decision-making. In the project management field, this very much comes into like project selection or alternative selection, that kind of thing. What it does is it basically just changes your conventional cost, your benefit to cost ratio into a benefit to cost plus risk, and cost being all of your outflows and risk being what's the potential damage, right? The idea again is to come up with something, to come up with a solution, or to come up with a way to have something that is successful enough that you can actually achieve, that you can actually get to an end without winding up blowing your budgets and that kind of stuff. So one of the important things with this whole idea of this benefit cost thing, one of the alternatives that I want you to always consider when you're doing risk-based decision making, one of the alternatives that should always be on your plate is do nothing, or make no changes. That should always be something you should consider, because that has by default the lowest cost of effort. But it may have the highest risk, but it may also have it could have a very low risk. So there's always the possibility that from a risk-based decision-making perspective, doing nothing or not making a change or not implementing a feature is actually the best choice. It's the one that you can be successful at. We're human beings. We're all pretty successful at doing nothing when we choose to. So we might want to intervene a little bit and just make sure we have that at least that one other option available to us at all times. Because remember, this is about making decisions. And if you don't have different paths you can take, you're not making a decision. If the only direction you can go is forward and the only step you can take is the next one, then there's no decision to be made. You just take the step, save yourself the analysis, and don't worry about justifying it. So the reasons we use risk-based decision-making, and this is general broad brush stuff, but you have better overall outcomes, regardless of the arena where risk-based decision-making is a fit, whether you're talking aerospace, manufacturing, IT, or you're talking big infrastructure projects, or you're talking maybe you're talking a family vacation. You're going to have better outcomes overall if you consider the probabilities and the probabilities and impacts of the things that could go wrong along the way. At a very surface level, and this ties into how you manage your projects and how you manage efforts at the very surface level, you identify some risks some things that could go wrong, and you take initial steps to mitigate or avoid those kinds of risks. You basically plan, understanding those things could happen, and you take steps to alter the path. You make a decision to do something differently, and that leads you to a more effective outcome overall. It helps project management, because one of the biggest problems with projects generally, one of the biggest things that causes projects to fail is just a failure to identify risks. Risk-based decision-making, it's based in risks. You have to identify risks. That's part of the deal. So every place you're making decisions in your project, whether it's a decision to work a certain shift, maybe you've got work that can be done efficiently during the day, but it can be done safely at night, or vice versa. If you can, when you make a decision about what to do during the day and what to do at night on your project, that can be a risk-based decision. If you're deciding, is this daytime or is this nighttime? That helps you manage your project, because it helps you align resources and tasks to the relative risk. So you tend to pool things where there's a higher level of risk, and you can make the smart decision to use maybe fewer resources or maybe more flexible resources where there's maybe not so much risk. And again, it gives you that bigger picture of what risks are involved in this project. And on this project management thing, it also helps with your project selection, so your strategic management of projects. One of the common things that I see a lot when having discussions with folks about projects and project failures, a lot of times people are concerned about the the second and third and fourth order effects after a project fails. So they're concerned about, well, if this project fails, then our company's going to have XYZ reputation hit. But the thing is the acceptability of that possible reputation hit, that should have been taken care of or should have been identified through a risk-based decision-making process when your organization decided to undertake that project. In other words, the choice to undertake the project means that the possibility of a major reputation hit is totally acceptable. Whatever that probability and likelihood is, and again, it's whether you identified it or not, that likelihood and the potential fallout from a PR problem was seen to be acceptable given the context of the project. So you might want to, when you back things up into thinking about running a discrete project, and you think more about how can risk-based decision making help your enterprise and help your strategic project management. It can help you funnel projects and maybe take a bright shiny project that sounds really cool but has a really bad potential downside if it doesn't go well, and either resource it and cost it correctly so you can overcome those risks, so you can make sure it's successful, or maybe not pick that project, maybe choose a different project so that you dodge that big PR hit. Sure, you might sacrifice a little bit of ROI, you might sacrifice a little bit of absolute revenue or something like that. But if you can choose project B that maybe doesn't have that PR hit hanging over its head or that reputation hit hanging over its head, then that might be the option you should take. Additionally, risk-based decision-making increases our stakeholder confidence. And this is just everybody involved with our project. And that includes our project teams, the teams' families, the communities, everybody who can be touched by our projects. Stakeholder confidence is largely driven by the understanding that we know what we're doing, that we ourselves as the people managing the project, or we the people managing the initiative or whatever it is. Stakeholder confidence is driven significantly by the stakeholder trust that we know what we're doing and that we have considered all the downsides and we have taken appropriate steps to deal with those things. And by risk-based decision making, by getting out front and identifying some risks and all the critical risks and figuring out, essentially, given the risk profile, given the benefit profile, this project is still worthy, and we can show that. Because it is an analytical process. We can show that we made a conscious, deliberate decision to proceed, understanding it has this amount of risk and this amount of expected return, and it's going to have this amount of expected variability. We understand that's the thing, and we can share that with our stakeholders. Then our stakeholders are more confident that we will actually deliver what we said we can deliver. And that's kind of what this is all about, is getting to an acceptable, positive outcome that we can actually achieve. It's being able to actually deliver, not promising this and delivering that, and not, none of that kind of sales craziness where you under promise and over deliver, because that's kind of garbage. and it leads to people not necessarily trusting that you'll deliver what you say you'll deliver, because you're always promising one thing and delivering something else. We want people to have confidence that we will do what we said we're going to do, and we will do it fully aware of what we're walking into. Now, throughout this whole presentation, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to use the chat. I'm watching the chat. But at this point in time, is there any thoughts about risk-based decision making and whether or not it's something you should maybe think about or maybe bin? So something to think about. Now, consider whether throughout the whole idea with risk-based decision making, while you're thinking about it, to take take a second and think about how you actually make decisions, like you personally, not necessarily your organization, you personally. How do you make decisions? Do you think about what could go wrong among the myriad of choices you have? Carefully think about the differences. So we'll have an example when we get towards the end of this. But say, is there a time where overanalyzing what if that there's always a chance, and there's kind of a rule in projects. It's a good question. There's kind of a rule in any kind of a project that you're only going to spend an amount of time analyzing that is proportionate to the overall project. So if you have $1,000 project, you're not going to spend a lot of time doing analysis, or a $10,000 project, you're not going to spend a lot of time doing analysis. If you have a $100 million project, you're probably going to spend plenty of time doing analysis. But you're always going to be taking a share of it. Now, there's a lot of what you're looking at is you're basically trying to hit the big points. You're trying to hit the big obvious things. You're not necessarily trying to do a super detailed, ultra granular analysis of anything, but you're going to use whatever amount of analysis is proportionate to the project you're undertaking. So if you have a product or you have an initiative that has a very short time span and otherwise just at a surface glance has a reasonably acceptable risk profile, so you've got a reasonably good chance of success, you might not do a whole lot of analysis with that. But if you have a more critical project or something that has a whole lot of moving parts, carefully analyzing as many of the moving parts as is practical is only going to lead to a better result. It's only going to lead to a better result. Because remember, throughout this whole thing is we're analyzing decisions. We're trying to make a better decision. We're not trying to explore this feature versus that feature versus this other feature, except in the context maybe of risk. Examples you may have, like kinds of examples you may have for again in aerospace, we might have there might be a situation where you have an airplane that it's got a certain type of maintenance due on it. There's all kinds of stuff on airplanes that's due like by certain numbers of hours, but you have something that's coming up due. The airplane could, on its time, it could make one more flight, and then it would have to go in for maintenance. You'd make a risk-based decision about whether or not you needed to do the maintenance first, or whether you could let it fly and do the maintenance later. And there will be factors involved, such as what are the odds of the plane going over its maintenance time in flight because of a diversion, or because of bad weather or something. Essentially how close is your comfort margin good enough, or is the buffer good enough that you could actually make that? Is there actually a real danger of going over that maintenance interval? So is there a physical mechanical problem, or is there a regulatory problem, or maybe is there some kind of business challenge you may have because of that? And you would make that decision to either fly and then do the maintenance, or do the maintenance and then before you fly. You would make that decision based on the risk profile, because at the end of the day, the flight's going to happen either with this airplane or another airplane likely, and there will be customer delays. There will be complaints possibly. Those kind of things are all in play, but you want to examine the risks involved with the decision, and not just say, well, we can squeeze one more out because efficiency. That may not be the smart move. You may land your plane and then find out that if you didn't think it through, you might land your plane, find out that it had a weather delay, and now that pushed that plane into a different maintenance category, and now you can't fly that plane again for a month, because now it has to do a complete teardown instead of just inspection because you went over the maintenance interval and there's things required. That kind of stuff can happen, but we'll have a little bit more of a practical sort of decision thing towards the end here. Now, the basic process for risk-based decision making is pretty simple. There we go. It's got a weird rendering thing going on. 1 second. There we go. Every once in a while, the network glitches out on my bullets here. So, all right. So the basic process is first of all we have to identify the decision. This is a decision-making analysis thing. It's not a it's not a how do we get to the other side of this known solution on a known path. It's not about making, simple do we don't we kind of things, although that's important. It's important that there are alternatives. We have to have things we're trying to accomplish. We're going to identify and analyze the risks that are involved, and we'll get a little more detailed in this as we go. We're going to figure out how to manage the risks if we can, because simply looking at what the potential things are going to go wrong is only part of it. We need to look at in the spectrum of our decision, we need to look at what could we do about it. For example, with that airplane, if the airplane could run into a maintenance interval problem, we need to consider, okay, if that bad weather materializes, can we divert the plane and get it on the ground ahead of its maintenance interval, and for that one risk, and is that worth the circumstances or whatever we're going to have to do for that? And then we have to make a decision. So once we figure out what the risks are, and once we figure out what the potential directions we can go are, and what the risk profiles are, and how we're going to deal with that kind of thing, then we actually have to make a decision. And then we watch and we adjust, because we know going in, no decision and no analysis is going to be perfect. Kind of as the question earlier indicates, is there a place we're going to overanalyze? So we're not going to try to be exhaustive. We're not going to try to find the absolute down to the 25th decimal place kind of answer for anything. We're trying to make a decision, a reasonably timed decision, a reasonably resourced decision that considers the totality of the circumstances, including the resources we have to make the decision. So look at kind of detailed things. These are obviously the first things we have to do. The risk-based decision making, we have to have a decision. So there has to be a point in time where we have different paths we can take. And we have to identify what those paths are. Now, in most places, we're going to have way more than a do we, don't we. There's going to be way more than just should we go this way or should we go that way, or should we stay where we are? I would give you three. If you got to a fork in the road, you actually have three choices. You can or four choices. You can stop or you can go back the way you came. But you need to identify what the specific decision is you're going to make. Now, this is very common. The kind of decision you might make is something like a make or buy decision. Where you're gonna make something in house, or you're gonna buy it. You're either gonna build an application in house, or build something in house, or you're gonna buy the commercial version of it. And then you weigh, kind of your decision is based around which one of those is going to satisfy our necessary success criteria and our risk tolerance. In a simple make or buy decision, quite often that comes down to just a financial decision, but the result is often much worse than it should have been, because the risks of doing things the cheap option are going to be higher. There's a reason things cost more if you buy them directly sometimes. But that's the first thing. You got to have a decision. You got to figure out what the landscape of that decision is. And remember, doing nothing or not moving forward should always be part of your consideration. And this may mean, in the case of like a project that's ongoing, this may mean delaying the project deliberately so you have more time to analyze. That could very well be appropriate. Again, depend on the scale and scope of your projects, but for small projects, it may not be worth it. But for a large project where you've got $100 million on the line, or you've got a major community stakeholder that's a huge risk factor or something like that, it may be worth pushing the project back for a month or a quarter or a year or something, so you can do more in-depth analysis and get a better understanding. But you need to define kind of what those potential decisions are, including the do nothing, including the don't fix it. That should always be an option. When we analyze our choices, networks, there we go. So a big thing when we analyze the risks. So we're gonna, after we kind of figure out what our decision is, we're going to identify and analyze the risks. And this is just the same as more or less how we run a project. This is basic project management stuff, but it's also basic decision stuff. So when we identify and analyze our risks, we're really just trying to figure out what the rough probability and rough impact is going to be. We're not trying to figure out, again, not down to like 27 decimal places. We're not trying to figure out the exact precise monetary cost. We're trying to figure out, essentially, is it so bad that we must deal with it? Is it something that we can probably just cope with if it happens? at a very, very minimal level, you need to figure out, is the impact, is the probability, is it likely or not likely? So is it more than 50% or less than 50% at a very, that would be an acceptable way to analyze it, especially for a small project. And then for the impact, is it something that is it bad, or is it maybe not so bad? And that's totally fine. You can just analyze it at a basic qualitative level. Now you're going to want to have at some point in time an understandable threshold of what that means. You're going to want to have maybe some kind of a heuristic to make that kind of a decision and not just wing it. But all you're looking for is figuring out what's the probability, what's the rough probability and rough impact. You're not trying to be super, super, super precise with it. And then when you manage risks, when you figure out what those risks are, then you're going to figure out, okay, what's your response? So that's the how do we deal with it preemptively? That's our mitigation. So how do we reduce the probability or reduce the impact? And then you're also going to consider the contingencies. So what happens if this risk actually comes to pass? And that's the importance of understanding when you look at that, when you look at the impact and the determined probability of impact, that's the importance of understanding whether it's a horrible impact or maybe a not so bad impact or maybe something in between, but not trying to be super, super granular about it. If you do a risk response and you kind of guesstimate how that's going to come out, maybe you mitigate it, maybe you reduce the likelihood of it, but the resulting impact is still horrible. So you're dealing with a horrible contingency. That by itself may indicate that this risk profile is something you don't want to deal with, but you've thought about it and you've done a little bit of analysis. For most risks, this is something you can do in a few minutes. This isn't a huge deal. So if you had a dozen risks, this is maybe an hour, 2 hours of your time. It's not going to be an enormous effort on a per risk sort of basis. Now, the third part here, we have to make the decision. So we figured out what the decision is. We know what the alternatives are. We know what the risk profile of each of those alternatives is. And understandably, we should also know what the cost is, and and if there's a potential benefit differential in there, we should know that. But we know what the risk differences are. So we know that option A is fairly unlikely, but is absolutely horrible risk. We know that option B is kind of a maybe not so bad kind of risk, and option C is a really likely but a pretty manageable sort of risk. And you're going to make a decision on which of those paths you want to take. Depending on your organization, there's not a right answer. The right answer is the one that gets you for risk-based decision making, is the one that's going to get you to the most likely chance of a successful outcome. So if the horrible risk, if you think the horrible risk is maybe unlikely enough that you're willing to roll the dice on that, rock on. Do your thing. You can choose that path. That's fine. That's going to be a determination with you and your organization about what does that actually look like. With maybe the other side of that, with option C, maybe if there's a risk that you're likely to see, could be something like a member of your project team is going to be out on sick time. A critical person on your team is going to be out on sick time. That's something, somebody critical for that decision path. So yeah, that's something that's fairly likely to happen on any given workforce. But if it just means a delay of a day or two, it might not be that big a deal, and you're just willing to you're willing to roll with it. It's not a huge thing. So that's going to be your choice as far as making the decisions, and then you're going to watch. So you're going to make the decision, and you're going to watch, and you're going to keep tapping a little bit on both sides to make sure that the risks as you identified them are the ones that you see, and there's not any new ones creeping in. But you're basically, at this point in time, you're basically just practicing more or less routine project risk management. You're just trying to make adjustments and make sure that if something happens, you can always, or if you see a risk coming that maybe you didn't identify initially, you still need to manage that risk. You still need to add that to the profile and make whatever modifications you need to make whatever mitigations and things. But you don't have to go kind of nuts with it. You just have to watch, see what happens, see how that alternative's going. And part of the seeing how it's all going ultimately is so you can capture that understanding and feed that forward into your next decision or your next project. We're always for capturing the lessons learned and making sure that whatever situation we have, we're able to learn from it and be smarter from it. Even if we were wrong, we still want to learn from it, be smarter for it. So the overall process is essentially just basic risk management in a project, but we're doing it treating more or less a specific decision as a risk unto its or as a project kind of phase all by itself. We're figuring out which ways to go, and we're making a decision about what action to take or what path to take based on that specific risk profile and that specific likelihood of achieving success at the end of that path or getting to the other side of that problem. That's what we're trying to do. Now, an example, told you it was coming. This is an example would be something kind of common from any sort of a maintenance type activity. It could be anything for like an IT installation, IT project, something like this. We're missing test equipment for a procedure. So this is the scenario. We're missing test equipment for a procedure. Now, if we look at our basic problem here, we've got a process that we're going along in, and we identify this gap here. And this gap happens to be the missing test equipment. There's a procedure we need to perform. That's our problem or our gap. There's a procedure we need to perform. So we need to go into our risk-based decision making to see how to get past that. Now, the basic alternatives. So the first thing we do is identify. We got to figure out that there is a decision to make. Now there are possibly several ways around this. Again, remember, do nothing should always be considered, and analyze based on going across here. But we're not really going to look at that too much here. A little bit, but the idea here is okay. We've got basically these three alternatives. We got a decision to make. We have to pick one of these. So for this particular procedure, we can purchase the required equipment. We could re-engineer the step to use equipment we do have, or we can just skip this step. So we've got those three options. Purchase the equipment, re-engineer the step to use the equipment we do have, so put some redesign work on it, or just skip this step entirely. Now, intuitively, this is a question for you folks. Intuitively, which one of these carries the most risk? Risk being a chance of not being successful or a chance of a bad outcome. So the more likely the bad outcome, the more the risk. And I deliberately left off any kind of qualifying information. So assume that the procedure is whatever you think it is. Now anybody want to commit to what they picked and give us a kind of a one or two word thing or a real short description about why you think that that's the most risky one? I mean, they all have risk. They all have risk. There's none of them are risk free. Yeah, re-engineering. Certainly there's personnel risks involved. There's knowledge training risks. Skipping the step. Yeah, the step was included for a reason, and that reason may by itself have a total risk associated with it. It could be a regulatory thing, could be a required step. It's absolutely statutorily required. Yeah, the step could be critical to the process. The step itself could be absolutely critical to the process. New tool, yeah. So if we have equipment equipment for some reason we didn't have, it could be something we weren't familiar with, or we're not. It's kind of overlaps the re-engineering one from Claudia there about, well, it may be that there's additional training and additional people risks associated with the new equipment. Probably also procurement risks. Can we actually buy it? Is it actually available? Will it arrive in time? That kind of stuff. So yeah, we're getting the idea here is whether that particular which approach or how you evaluate those risks is going to be particular to the nature of the decision to be made. So is this step? So if we look at this step, and I've kind of put some notional stuff up here, but is this gap a regulatory thing that we must do, or is it an absolute safety thing we must do? Or is it something like maybe a kind of technical test that we should do, but we might be able to get away with it if our prior work was good enough, or we can discover later on in a process? Or is it something that's done like strictly for a demonstration purpose or a convenience purpose or something like that? But whatever this step is that requires this equipment, and we can get into a whole separate discussion about why we're missing the equipment to begin with. But if the step itself must be performed, then that means that this skip the step has a total risk. And again, of course, why is the step there? If we kind of uncover these things here, if we purchase the required equipment, I have that personally, again, my evaluation based on what I had in my head is that that purchasing the equipment is probably a low risk. Again, you got absolutely right that there could be training issues. There could be all kinds of other things, because maybe the equipment isn't just misplaced. Maybe it's an entirely new piece of equipment that nobody's ever used before. But initially, I'm putting it down as low risk because it's the equipment that the process is designed for. So the technical risk is pretty low as far as that. Now, you're absolutely right. There are personnel risks. That would be a different category. There could be procurement risks. That'd be a whole sort of thing. The purchase I have is a very high cost, because I'm trying to balance in my risk-based decision making what is the cost versus risk profile, and how am I going to find a happy median that's going to get me to an acceptable level of success without unnecessarily burdening my project beyond that. If we look at re-engineering the step, that I have, again, what's going on in my head is I had that as kind of possibly a medium to high risk, because you're replacing a published process. You're replacing a process, and when I'm thinking published, I'm thinking something like in a maintenance manual that's a manufacturer recommended kind of thing. It's replacing it. There could also be a time problem or a resource problem, because if we have to take resources from our project and dedicate them to this task of re-engineering the process, then those resources are probably not accomplishing work on our project. Or we may have to depend on slack time or slack schedule that's available with our existing resources. That could be a thing. So it may stretch out our schedule. There may be some schedule risk there also with this. And of course, also the personnel, also the re-engineering and retraining people piece could be with it. I have cost on this as being medium-ish relative, because we're using resources we already have, but we're using additional labor. Again, what's going on in my head, your analysis. If we were doing this for real, we would know what these figures are. We would know what they actually mean. But again, the perspective on this, it depends on the context of your project. And of course, the skip step is probably a very high risk, because as you indicated, the step is this step we have here, this task we have to perform is probably there for a reason. It's a safety thing, a quality thing, a validation thing. It could be something that's there, a regulatory thing. That step is there for some reason. If we could have skipped a step in our project or skipped the step in this process, then we should probably rewrite the process to just get rid of that step if we don't need it. But it has the benefit of being basically no cost. In fact, it could be actually a cost savings, because we're not spending the time and effort we're not spending labor hours to do that work. But that's the challenge here, is how do you balance these out? Now, among the assembled here, what do you think would be, what do you think, or how do you think you would balance cost versus the risk? How do you think you might balance the cost versus the risk? That's a whole separate discussion that would take us another hour. But consider that and think about that. If you have, would you be willing in a situation, and we'll just assume there's not a regulatory requirement. So I'll give you that one for free. If there's not a regulatory reason, so there's not a thou shalt associated with this. If there's not a you must complete this step no matter what. Would your organization be willing to try skipping the step just because it's not going to cost you anything, it's probably going to save you some time? It could save you some time. I've found a lot of organizations will do this. A lot of organizations will, if there's not a compulsory reason, there's not somebody outside looking in, holding that notional sword above their head saying you will do this step. You're doing this overall thing is a cost. It's a cost plus risk to benefit. So you'd absolutely want to do that. You'd absolutely want to figure out, okay, what is the nature of this risk? What is the nature of the cost? You would probably want to figure out what the likelihood is, because think about if this skip a step doesn't work, your contingency planning for skip a step is pick one of these other two. Is to go back and pick one of these other two. So that could be a thing. Skip a step, or essentially the do nothing option. If that doesn't work out for you, then you've got to then you want to have in your pocket the contingency that, okay, if that doesn't work, then you were either going to have to purchase the equipment or re-engineer this thing, in which case you've incurred those additional risks and costs. But you're making a gamble essentially, or you're making an analytical decision about, is it worth it? Is it a good decision or a smart decision to skip the step initially and see how it works out? Presuming, like I said, there's not a statutory reason you have to do that. Because your contingency, of course, like I said, your contingency for skipping the step, if it goes wrong, you're going to have to repeat the step. You're going to have to repeat the work, in which case the only thing you have is one of the other two options. Or possibly the option of, okay, well, we're going to stop this project right now because it's just not worth doing anymore. And you would definitely want to do that cost-benefit analysis over the remaining project, because there's a chance that this could be something so critical that if you don't do it, the rest of the project is just a waste of time. And that's something we want to be really conscious of when we're doing this kind of stuff. So we looked at some questions today. So we looked at what is risk-based decision-making, why to use it, and how to use it. As you go forward, look for opportunities where you can, where you have a decision, or really what I want you to do is kind of think about where your organization, or maybe where you personally, where you are just trying to follow task to task to task to task, and you come into a problem. Notice whether you see that as a decision point or not. Notice whether you just focus on getting the other side in with whatever occurs to you, or do you actually stop for a second and say, hey, there's a problem here. How many different ways could we overcome this problem? Or what are a few ways we could overcome this problem? And then do a little bit of risk-based decision analysis on each of those decisions. So cost benefit plus risk, right? So what are the relative cost and risk profiles for each of those alternatives? A lot of organizations, a lot of people get stuck because they see one solution and they immediately jump on it and start justifying it and validating it and all that kind of stuff. And they spend a lot of time trying to make that one solution work, when it's possible they get a better result by just stopping for a second, considering that there are probably at least 3 or 4 or 5 possible ways to approach this problem, and doing a little bit of analytical work, even if it's just back of the napkin stuff, and think about, okay, well, if we can buy a solution, or we can buy our way out of it, what is that implications versus if we maybe have to retrain some people or do something different internally, what's that implication versus what if we just go around it and we just ignore this issue or we put the whole thing on the back burner for a while and do something else? What are the risks and what are the consequences of that? And then making a decision based on what that picture looks like. If you can do that, you will be on a path to actually having better outcomes overall because you're considering, you're taking a second and you're making a decision and not just jumping on whatever bridge you happen to find that will just get you over to the next side of whatever your problem is. So I think we got a few minutes. Are there any thoughts, concerns? All right, yeah, suggestions for helping decision makers avoid biases during the risk-based decision-making process. A big one to kind of help decision makers get over biases is have something like a systematic approach to how you analyze the risks. There's a whole separate class on I can do a whole separate thing on actually doing risk analysis, but have some kind of an idea within the context of the decision that you have a procedure for, or at least a heuristic, kind of an on paper rule for, of what is a high impact, what is a medium impact, what is a low impact, what is a high likelihood, what is a low likelihood. Have some kind of a framework to operate around that, because what you want to do is you want to if you're the analyst, you want to be able to convince your decision makers that you have made the recommendation based on data, based on objective data and reasoned out rational procedures that apply to any decision. You want to make sure that when they look at any kind of a decision they have to make, that they're certain that whatever they see, it's apples to apples all the way across, that they're not seeing something as a high impact here because it was a schedule impact, and this one has a budget impact, but it's listed as low because the person who is doing it doesn't really care about money. They want to make sure that what is a high impact is high impact all the way across. What is a low impact is a low impact all the way across. And that is the first thing. The second thing is probably just educating decision makers on what risk-based decision making is, making sure that they understand that it's not that the aim of risk-based decision making is getting to the most likely successful outcome, not optimizing one specific metric, not optimizing in case in what seems to might be behind the question there, might be optimizing their pet metric. You're looking at all the possible things and considering what's the most likely path to a successful outcome, not what's the path to a very specific outcome, because good enough is good enough. And we are successful if we are good enough the vast majority of the time. Did that address the question, or is there more to that? Awesome. What else you got? Generally speaking, I'm a fan of having of norming across your teams. So if you're in an organization that has several analysts or does a lot of different analytical work, is kind of get together with the different people and figure out how do you want to collectively approach stuff like this. What figures do you use to, what is the basis for determining a non-monetary benefit? What is the basis for determining a non-monetary impact? And how do you use that and norm that across your whole organization? That can help a lot. There's a lot to be said about building a culture of robust analytics that's not just folks embracing the latest whiz-bang tool. There's nothing you need as far as whiz-bang tools beyond like an Excel spreadsheet to calculate any of this kind of stuff, to do anything with valuation. One part of my career, I spent about 8 or 9 years. I did this sort of thing for major federal acquisitions. I did this sort of thing for procedure and policy changes for a federal agency. And the key to doing it well and the key to getting our recommendations accepted was that we had a process and everybody used the same process. So if I wrote down something that said this was going to cost, this had $1 million of benefit and was going to cost us $100,000, then within the tolerances of the estimates, you could bank on somebody else doing the same analysis would be close. They would come up with the exact same thing, so that whatever recommendation went forward was really truly the best way to capture what was important to our agency and our taxpayers, so that the results on balance were always pointing at the best use of our money, the best use of our resources. And that's kind of what we're trying to get to, is ultimately the best use, because the best use is what gets us to success. The best use is not necessarily when it gets us the last decimal point on a balance sheet. I think, barring any other questions, I think that pretty well does this. Oh, there we go. Yeah, that is a good thing, and not even just for risk specifically, but for all of your analysis, for cost analysis, benefit analysis, risk analysis, all that. Yeah, having a agreed upon framework, having an agreed upon way that you score and source things, that gets you a long ways to being able to be seen as reliable, and have your decisions treated as, as the end of an analytical process guiding the decision makers. So, if you give them an unbiased input, you greatly increase the chances of having a relatively unbiased output. And from there, it's all politicking. It's all how do you deal with that phone call? Any other way you can, any other way you can make decisions is an alternative to risk-based decision making. Risk-based decision making is it is a more of an approach to making decisions. It's making decisions based on risk. Any other factors that you include is going to be a way you can adjust or modify risk-based decision making. You can use tools to make strictly financial decisions. You can use tools to make strictly even time-based decisions, things like that. So you can use different sorts of financial analysis. There's all kinds of things like decision trees and decision tree analysis and time-based analysis of money and all that kind of stuff. Those all contribute to whatever the decision is. Because again, risk-based is not risk exclusively. It's just the risk is the major factor. Yeah, definitely present your solutions as yes, no. So you want your decision makers to accept or reject your recommendation. You don't want them to have to come up with a derived decision from the recommendation you gave them. Quite possibly give them give decision makers the option to accept with modifications, or reject. Well, the ideal closer to ideal for using risk-based decision making for sharing with decision makers. One of the things you want to make sure is that you're capturing the risks that they are concerned about. That you're capturing what that decision maker thinks is important, or what that decision maker thinks is critical. If you have a decision maker, for example, if you have a decision maker who's very concerned about schedules generally, or timeframes generally, then recommendations need to include maybe a little bit higher weighting for schedule type risks. And again, this would feed into your general analysis stuff. If decisions to that person, they need to always consider that. A big thing is you want to make sure that whatever recommendation you provide does not leave out something that they think is obvious. Doesn't leave it out. Now, this may mean that you include something and that you list something and then you explain in very short, specific terms why it's not relevant. But don't leave a consideration out if your decision maker is likely to think it should be obviously included or obviously addressed. I've had many, many, many business case recommendations that I produced that were they included what certain decision makers or certain congressional aides thought were obvious things to think about that were just completely irrelevant, and I had to put down a paragraph of this alternative is not relevant to this project because of statute or whatever. Or it was being handled by it was part of an entirely separate ongoing project. But yeah, just don't make it look like don't make it look like you want the decision maker to figure it out for you, and don't leave off anything that they think is either important or should be obvious. Other than that, just good analytical work and being true and honest and transparent with how you got what you got, or how you scored. If you can get all that wired up, then you're very well positioned to being able to have your recommendations push forward. Thanks everybody for having me.